For most families, it starts with a phone call. Maybe it was the neighbor, maybe maybe it's actually your parent themselves. And it starts with, I'm okay, but, and in that pause, everything changes, right? Not because of the fall itself, but what the fall actually represents. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to just share with you what really happens and what really changes in that moment for most families when they learn about a fall. I'm going to spend about the next 20 minutes or so sharing with you what that moment really means for families who navigate it well versus those who don't. Hi, my name is Vitaly, and welcome to inHom Senior Care. So glad that you are here. For the last 23 years, we've been in this space where we help families to care for their loved ones and help them age in place in their own home. And of course, we provide caregivers to help families actually take the next step and allow for that process to come in and help them with whatever needs that they have. But we also are hugely involved in helping families to just navigate and learn and gain the resources and education that they need to be able to know what those next steps are and just understand and get the support that they need as a caregiver themselves, helping their aging loved one walk this road. Here's what most families don't really know going into this. A fall is rarely just a fall. Falls are one of the top reasons that aging at homes can plan suddenly change. Not because the person is suddenly more fragile, but because the fall makes visible what's already there, what's sort of underneath. And see, the idea of a fall, like think about it, like I've fallen. I mean, we fall lots of times as kids, and as we get older, we get more stable, but at the same time, falls make a big difference in terms of just being dependent on what age you are, right? So if you're in your 20s and you have a fall, even if it's a serious fall, you will be able to recover from that much easier than somebody who is 85, right? And have their bone density is very different, and just their ability to be able to recover from that fall is quite a bit different. So think about what what a fall can actually indicate. So we can talk about a balance decline, right? Because part of why we're able to hold ourselves up and we're able to walk around upright is how our muscles are able to work together to hold up the whole structure of the body and be able to not be in a position where we're tripping or where we're losing a balance. Weakness or fatigue that wasn't being monitored, medication side effects, maybe vision changes, maybe obstacles in the home like rugs and other things like that. Maybe even cognitive shifts, so slower reaction time or poor spatial awareness to be able to step down into a sunken living room or walk up a set of stairs. And of course, the hazards of the environment, like I already mentioned, like rugs or just a chair being pushed out too far, or poorly lit hallways, or just something else that could be in the way. So when a fall happens, it's the question that's worth asking isn't just, are you okay? Is mom all right? Did anything bad happen? Is there a fracture? But is there more to this? Is it revealing something in terms of, is there a larger process, right? Because I talk a lot about triggers, triggers that trigger care, or triggers that trigger a company like us to be called to say, hey, we may need some help. A lot of times that trigger may be bathing, because the family's been doing lots of things helping mom with, but bathing kind of steps over into that uncomfortable territory. Like, I don't want to give my mom a bath. I just don't want to do that. So we'll bring in a company, we'll bring in professionals to be able to help us with that. Well, fall tends to be similarly a shocking event, right? None of us want to witness or to hear about our mom falling. It's a scary scenario. And so it can really very quickly emotionally accelerate just this idea of like, whoa, we got to slow down and figure out what's happening, because I don't want something bad to happen. So before I even get into about what to do, I just want to share and talk about what it is that families feel, because there's emotions on both sides. And part of why mom may not be as willing to share that she had a little tumble, and she might say, well, I'm all right, like nothing to worry about. And she may have had a few more of those, but she didn't tell you about, because her own emotions are that I don't want to be treated like I'm some fragile thing, and I don't want to have my kids overstep and all of a sudden tell me that I need to move or I need to do some other things. And for the adult child, and if that's you that's watching this, it's the fall of your parent, of your mom, your dad, triggers something in you. It triggers some anxiety and triggers something in terms of, I am responsible for this. I don't want this to happen on my watch. I don't want something bad to happen and me walking into your house or your apartment and finding you on the floor. All of a sudden, that weight of that responsibility is on the shoulders of the adult child. And if that's who you are, I'm sure you've experienced that. I'd love to hear in the comments, if you would, just about some of the things that you think about and some of the things that come to mind as you process some of that information when you think about potentially dealing with your loved one's fall. And again, for the parent, sometimes the bigger concern is for what that fall or the admission of the fall may trigger after the fact than the physical concern of, I fell and I could have gotten hurt. And of course, many falls happen and the person doesn't necessarily get hurt. They may end up being in a position where they may need physically some help to get back up, but they may not have a fracture. But of course, then there's the extreme stories and the situations where your mom would have called you, but her phone was on the table and she fell and she couldn't get to it because she did have a fracture. And actually, the medically, right, the ability to recover from a fall is proportionate to the amount of time that somebody spends on the floor before they can actually get help. And so that's a real important factor to think about potentially. What can we do to make sure that there is a safety net, some sort of precaution in place to make sure that if that did happen, the cell phone may not be the best process to rely on, because that cell phone may be left on a table, it may be in a pocket, it may be the person fell and they rolled on it and they can't actually get to it. So there's some other things that we'll talk about that way. That's what we've had plenty of clients who have told me that, my mom didn't call me for hours. Or when we finally got it out of her, she told me she's fallen 5 times before and just didn't want to bring it up because their generation, the person who's aging, is more concerned about the overstep of the younger generation and all of a sudden taking away their independence because they're perceived as someone who now needs to be handled with kid gloves because they are fragile and need help and need protection. So understanding both sides of this dynamic of the relationship of the older generation and the younger generation is really what allows families to have a productive conversation and come together to construct a productive plan for something that will work. And it allows, I think, for a more realistic approach on one side to understand that there's a certain amount of risk to life, including falls for all ages, but also understanding that as we age and get older, that fall can have much more significant consequences in terms of the actual event when the fall happens that potentially is a fracture or some kind of life-altering break or injury. And then in terms of the recovery and being able to come back to an independent state of being and independent life is challenging. And so on one hand, the risk to the fact that falls exist or the risk of falls exist. And so working within that reality and then understanding that putting together a prudent safety plan of some sort is really a productive way to look at it, to be able to say, okay, you want to age at home, that's very understandable, and it's something we want to work towards. But as your son, I don't want to be in a position where I feel like I'm just guilty and feel responsible. And if something happened to you, I would feel like this is all completely my fault. And so how could we put together a plan that works for both and we have some safety measures in place to ensure that the care that you need is being provided and that you've set yourself up for a good plan to be able to make sure that this will work. So here's something that I want you to sit with. Most serious falls are preceded by a pattern of smaller warning signs. Weeks, sometimes months earlier, the fall is rarely the beginning of the story. It's often the visible end of one. So let me kind of walk you through the warning signs that most families commonly miss because they start slowly, and then because they start slowly, over time they can start to feel like normal. Like this is just kind of where mom is now operating at. And it's something that doesn't necessarily trigger a red flag. So first is furniture surfing. It's where you see your aging loved one walking around by grabbing the couch and then transferring their other arm to a chair. And as they're walking through, they're using furniture for support because when they let go of it, their balance is not where it should be. And so they feel much more steady by having their hand on something. Second is the near falls that were never mentioned. It's the stuff that's happened in between, and maybe at some point it comes out that, well, yeah, I've taken a tumble, or I tried to sit in a chair and I kind of missed, and so some of these kinds of things that have already been happening but weren't big enough to pick up and to notice. Third is the changes in confidence around the home. Avoiding the stairs, talking about how hard it is to walk around, trying to sit more, and especially after a fall's already happened, there may be a tendency and a temptation to just stay put more because every time they get up, there is obviously that risk that they're gonna fall again. Fourth is a fatigue that doesn't match the activity. So like being exhausted after small errands, napping more than before. So just fatigue overall in the body, not necessarily talking about, weak legs or weak muscles or whatnot. Fifth is difficulty getting out of chairs. So sitting in a chair and then just maybe attempting 2 or 3 times before being able to get up, right? So that's signaling to you that the strength in the legs and in the arms potentially is not quite where it was or not where it probably should be. So none of these, alone is any sort of a crisis or something that all of a sudden we have to go, whoa, we got to fix something. But starting to see more than 2 or 3 of these are starting to come together as a picture that, yeah, there's some significant issues there. So I want to be honest with you about something. Most families wait longer than they should before addressing fall risk. And I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty, right? I'm saying it because it's normal and because understanding why it happens is the first step to doing something different. And so here's usually how this kind of works. The changes are gradual because as the person ages and what was normal at 70 and the adaptations and adjustments they've made, you see them and they're still functioning, and so it becomes a norm. And of course we're busy and we're doing things. When we get together, we try not to kind of step into this role of assessor and assessing how things are going, and so sometimes we tend to miss things. And the reason why falls risks are such an important factor to at least gauge and to understand kind of where things are at is because a significant enough fall can really change the ability of the person to be independent where they are, right? So to be able to age in place or to be able to continue life at a quality that they've had. And so small things that can be done to help lower the risk of falls, right? We can never remove it. I talk about that multiple times in our videos that we do, is that there's always risk to life, and falls risks are part of all of our being in existence, but the older you get, that risk goes up. But it's also the repercussions from a fall are the risk is much higher in terms of what it does to our future and what it does to the quality of life of that person. So there is some guilt, I think, associated with the idea of bringing in outside help. So family caregivers a lot of times feel like, man, I shouldn't have to rely on other people. Like, this is my mom. I need to step up and I just need to help with whatever she's dealing with. But the reality is, like lives are busy and people have children later in life now, and so a lot of times they're sandwiched and they're dealing with their own family, with their own kids, and sometimes distances between where we live add into this dilemma in terms of just in order to visit and go do something, and maybe a 45-minute drive or maybe an hour drive there and back. And so all of that compounds, and as a caregiver, as a family caregiver, as a daughter, burnout may be a very significant potential or a factor when we try to take on all those issues ourselves. And so that's why it's important to look at some kind of comprehensively as to what a good plan might look like to address falls and the risk of fall. So there's a version to this story that kind of goes like this, that there's a fall and something significant happens and there's a ER visit and maybe let's just say it's a broken hip. And in this country, we do a phenomenal job of operating on people and being able to restore them really quickly, replacing their hip and getting them back on their feet. And so somebody would probably end up in a transitional unit, in a TCU, as we would say, and spend a little time with some rehab to be able to come back. But then there usually comes a very fast decision process as that person needs to be discharged from that facility in terms of, okay, we need to be over here, we need to move, we need to set up and do something different. It's one of those things that it's worth exploring before you get there, and so you can get the buy-in of your aging loved one. What are their wishes? What's possible? What's realistic? And so then you don't have to make that decision on a Friday. Believe it or not, one of our most common inquiry calls for service is to say, we need 24-hour care, but could you please start today? Right? And in some cases, it may be followed by, we've called one other company and it's basically whoever can start this soonest can have our business. And so it puts pressure on us as a company to say, all right, let's see what we can figure out. But the challenge to that scenario is it's not an ideal scenario, right? Because when you think about that process, when you think about trying to think of something that you want to be a quality process where we have to put together a care plan, figure out what the needs are, and then figure out who would be the ideal staff. And now we're trying to do this in such a hurried manner, it's very difficult to perceive that process to have the sort of normal prep that a quality process should have. And so that's why in some of these videos, my goal is to really help educate and to help families get to a point where they understand these things a little bit earlier. And so they're ready. They have a plan. They have some things that they already know what their loved one would wish and would prefer. They might already have engaged with a company like us and they've got some things in the works. And in fact, the best scenarios for some of these things is actually having some maintenance care in place, right? And maybe 3 days a week and just helping with some basic things. And because again, like if we're there 3 days a week, I mean, we're not going to be necessarily able to prevent or stop a fall if it were to happen. But the care is already in place. There's a caregiver introduced. There's a process in the company. And so if that scenario were to unfold, all of a sudden you already have a company in your corner that can expand the care and come in with more hours and be able to provide whatever those needs may be, versus now you're trying to figure out this super fast decision and your call as to who's going to be your provider is based on who can like race to my door faster. And so this is what I wanted to get at today. I'm sharing all this with you right now, not to scare you, but because right now, if you're watching this before the crisis, you're in the best position, right? You have time, you have options. You can be thoughtful instead of being reactive. So let's talk a little bit about what safe aging at home actually looks like in practice, because I think a lot of families have a picture in their head that doesn't necessarily match reality. So picture is that mom's physically fine and she's in her house, she's safe and can stay home, and that's pretty much it. And the reality is much more layered than that, because safe aging requires 5 things to work together. Okay, so number 1 is physical safety. The environment matters, right? So we can live in an environment being a certain way when we're in our 30s or our 50s, that when we're 85 or 87 may need to be adjusted. So I'm talking about things like lighting. You know, is the lighting adequate? Like, I love low lighting. I love watching TV with barely any lights on in the house and just that ambience, and it's totally fine. But again, when you're 85, that may not be the best idea, right? Because there's going to be tripping hazards because of those light conditions. So especially the paths, you know, back and forth from the bedroom to the bathroom and those kinds of things. Now, grab bars would be another, you know, aspect or thought, you know, so like in the bathroom or in the shower, because you've got transferring going up and down and being able to use your arms to help you with that movement in addition to just using your legs. Rugs, footwear, right? Is wearing socks on hardwood floor, is that a slip hazard? probably. Thresholds and doorways have been hazards for years for somebody that's aged in a home that used to be super safe for them because of their ability and their age to get around, but now can potentially be a problem. Daily support, things like meals. Are they eating? Especially if they're living alone. You have to think about that because, so one of the things with care that we provide, we always talk about companionship being such a fundamental aspect of the care. And meals are a part of that because meals are social occasions. Meals are not just sustenance. They are, right? But as social beings, we enjoy the company of other people, and meals are typically eaten with others. So when we're living family life or as a couple, people eat together, they eat together with friends. Meals are shared, right? And so caregivers, when they prepare meals, very often 95% of our clients, the caregiver that's preparing a meal will sit and eat with that client unless uniquely the family is asking us not to do that, because it allows for that meal to be much more enjoyable. Are they eating? Medication management, right? Again, because those falls could be contributed by either missing medication or taking too much medication. And so making sure that the medications are set up correctly and they're being administered, self-administered potentially, right, properly is a big factor in this. Personal hygiene. Are they able to bathe themselves and use the bathroom independently? And again, going back to the grab bars and some of those kinds of things, is that environment safe enough because of that? Hydration, getting enough water and making sure that they're not going to have a fall because they actually fainted because they're dehydrated. Number 3 is observation. Someone is keeping an eye on things. Someone's paying attention. It can be a number of things, but obviously with caregiver support, with having a person in there, that provides that. And one of the things, so we have a minimum of 3 visits per week. And part of that is because it gives us enough of a window into what normal looks like, so that when that caregiver arrives and the client is acting in ways that doesn't fit normal, that caregiver is immediately aware, and maybe they're going to be raising a little bit of a red flag, maybe calling the office and try to figure out something might be going on. Maybe the person has an infection, maybe something else is happening. They're just not themselves because we know what normal is supposed to look like. And so that observation really is helpful. Technology can play a role. I know with my wife's grandparents, we had cameras installed. Everybody might have a different view on this philosophically or otherwise, and it was not any sort of a secret. It was open information with them, and they were on board, and they were happy that we had them because it allowed us, without coming over every time, to be able to just at a glance see what was happening and that things were being done correctly. And when we're providing care, in many ways, we tell our caregivers that they should expect that there's cameras potentially in the home, because every family has the right to oversee their loved one and oversee even the care that's being provided by someone even like us, to make sure that that care is not only adequate, but that care is exceptional. In many cases, I remember at least 2 where we were able to call 911 because grandma fell, and we were able to see that right away, and so we were able to get help. And by the way, when grandma fell, she went out of her way to ask grandpa not to tell anyone, like, get me up and don't tell nobody. Like, this is going to be something we're not going to tell anybody, right? Because of that fear factor that I talked about earlier. They don't want their independence taken away, and so they want to minimize or diminish the exposure and knowing about all their failings. And let's face it, like, when they're failing, it's just not something that we as human beings want to admit to. Like, we don't want to tell people that, man, I'm struggling, I'm tripping, I'm falling, right? It's just not a fun thing to admit. So that was number 3. Number 4 is social connection. And this is something that people really miss, or they don't think about it. And there's certainly, we're all unique creatures. So I know, like, my mom she doesn't need a ton of it, right? She does enjoy her alone time and being alone. But I know I can tell when I talk to my mom when her mood is off and she is emotional and just things going on, and it is because she is missing some companionship. She wants some connection. Now, I visit my mom, and our visits are usually fairly short. She doesn't need a lot of it, But most people, most of us, we're social beings and we want to connect with other people. And so when we, as I said before, the companionship is such a fundamental aspect of the care that we provide, that we want, we want to make sure that we understand and we address that issue, because otherwise we think about just the physical needs, we think about helping with a bath, or we think about making sure that they take their medications, making a meal. But it's that connection that is the most important and the most fundamental, because we all want to be known, right? We don't just want to have a little help with something. It's down even to the fact that, we go to the coffee shop that we like, and part of why we like it is because of the people that work there. We get to know the staff there, and if they can recognize us, and some of the best places know our drinks, some of us who are like creatures of habit and always get the same thing, like that gives us some comfort. And so caregivers coming over and connecting with the client and being able to talk about what yesterday was like, how they're doing, and just connecting and sharing that space is super important. So that social connection. So isolation actually accelerates both cognitive and physical decline. Research actually shows that spending time alone and not having social interaction will cause cognitive decline. And so it's important. And we know that seniors' world shrinks. They lose their friends, right? Their friends are dying, and sometimes they get moved to be in an area that's maybe closer to the daughter or closer to one of the kids. And so that in and of itself kind of deprives them of a social environment that they had wherever they were living, and now they're over here. And so naturally they just don't have people around them, don't have friends. Again, it can put a little more guilt factor on the family caregiver, on the daughter, because I have to play that role. And so professional caregiving really, really helps with that, because it allows mom to have her own sort of a peer relationship with the caregiver. And, when the daughter comes over, not only is there less expectation of that connection, but there's also less expectation of the things that need to be done, because that caregiver has already accomplished a lot of those things. So number 5 is a trusted point of contact for the family. So not just for the parent or not just for the client, but for you as the family. So the daughter or the son or whoever is kind of what we would call a point of contact, or a decision maker. And so, like, even with what we're doing with this video, our goal is to be a resource, because most people, when they get to these things, it's the first time they're dealing with them, right? Sometimes they've had the ability, okay, they took care of the parents of a spouse or something else, and so then they're, a few years later, they're back in that similar scenario. But a lot of times it's the first time around, and so it can be confusing. And you look at all these buildings, and they're so different and unique, and companies who provide care, they're also unique. And then there's some things that Medicare covers, there are some things that are private pay. And so having someone in your corner who has experience in the industry, but also in your local community, can really be helpful to help give you advice and to help you make the best decisions that you can. Someone that you could end up calling if you can, you're sensing that something's a little bit off, it's not quite functioning well. And it's a role that we take very seriously at inHom Senior Care, because again, if you look at our reviews and you see how we function, our care that we provide isn't just focused on that client. That obviously they're getting the care and they've got the caregiver working with them, but the family in most situations is very, very involved and making sure that their mom is getting what she needs. And so throughout that process, we may be feeding information saying, hey, we're picking up and noticing things are changing, and so we may talk about that. But it also many times comes from the family to say, hey, we're a little concerned with this. We really think maybe we should, or what do you think? And they may have those questions for us. And we love playing that role, because we want to be a trusted resource to the family to help walk with you in this journey of aging and helping someone age gracefully in their own home. So I want to leave you with some practical things, specific low-cost changes that genuinely reduce fall risk. And I'm giving you these because I'd rather you do these things now, regardless of whether you ever call us, right? That's not what this is about. So number one on that list is better lighting. So hallways that are dark, putting night lights or figuring out a way to have lighting there, and then maybe installing brighter bulbs so that there's very good lighting. If there's lamps that are plugged in, if there's any cords running across the carpet or across the floor that are a tripping hazard, easily address those that before you have to have any serious conversations. You can do some of that. Grab bars, but big caveat here, they need to be installed correctly. There are grab bars that you can buy that are like suction mounts, and yeah, they could probably work, but they could also fail. And so my recommendation would be to get those done professionally, have somebody install them to where they're anchored correctly into the wall, to where they're not a false sense of security, but they're truly solid anchor points. And so that's something that would be actually, so there's companies we can put you in contact with. Obviously it's not something we would do, but there's companies that do not only installation of those things, but they can actually come and help you do an assessment to just look for those areas that you can make that home much safer. Medication review with the physician. So this is even beyond setup, right? Because one of the things you have to be aware of is the fact that certain medications can interact with one another and can cause undesired side effects or potential for just being drowsy or other things that can contribute to a falls risk. And so just reviewing medications. Again, the older they get, the more likely they're seeing multiple doctors and maybe prescribe multiple medications. And so to be able to go back to a single doctor that can see the whole list of medications and go, oh my goodness, these things maybe shouldn't be taken together, or maybe they should be taken at different times of the day. But just getting a full assessment of that. And then especially things like blood pressure medications, sleep aids, diuretics, these things can affect the balance. And so sometimes even somebody that stands up out of a chair needing a moment, because as that blood kind of drains out of their head and the body has to reset itself for when they stand up. So, and honestly, this is kind of one of those things that just a few hours of just spending some intentional time to just look at those things and go through them really can help go a long way to make sure that you're starting out with a solid foundation of, look, okay, we're not leaving these things just a chance, but we're actually doing something about this. So, and I want to leave you with a reframe that I think is genuinely useful. So a fall is not a failure, right? It's not pleasant. It's one of those things that we want to avoid, but it is information. And it's oftentimes the moment that the family will actually kind of spring into action because they finally have a big enough sign that they're like, oh man, we've kind of been talking about stuff, but like now, like we got to do something. And it triggers some action. And it does cause enough of a, like, oh my goodness, like a bit of a fear moment for the senior to go, you maybe you guys are right. I know you've talked about maybe helping me or doing something, but it may cause them to be like willing to have that conversation. In the past 23 years or so of doing this, the families that do best with this, they don't panic, right? They don't, because you can go on the one side, you do nothing. On the other side, you act out of the sheer urgency and the panic of what just happened, and you're pulling crazy quick decisions in 24 hours. And so the reality is, like, once you have that, like, you can't undo it. It's happened, right? But okay, let's pause and let's look at some of these things and let's take a proactive approach and figure out what is a good plan, because hopefully that fall is not wasted in the sense that, okay, whatever, we'll see what happens next, right? But that we can now go, okay, let's just be adults and let's figure this out and figure out how we can be better prepared so that we don't have one again. And if we do, it's less severe and we've got some things in place, right? And the vast majority of families who engage in this process thoughtfully and look at all the different things and process all this, the parent stays home and they can stay home. And there's a plan that they develop and they stay home for longer than they thought possible in many situations. Because again, remember this, risk of falls isn't eliminated when you move into a building, right? There isn't something magical about that building that removes the risk of falls. So as a person ages, their risk of falls goes up, and some of that is actually due to their strength, right? Their muscle mass, and so with home care, we can actually just doing simple exercises like helping the person walk or helping them get around, or maybe doing physical therapy exercises with them, we can actually help them reduce that risk just by helping them strengthen their legs and being able to do that. For a lot of families, that gut reaction is like, we got to move Mom because she's at risk for falls. Moving her into a building doesn't remove that risk, right? It's just you're hoping because there's staff there and somebody would, I mean, at the best is somebody would find her maybe potentially faster. So keep that in mind, right? So when we talk about the dignity and a person's wishes of being able to age where they are and not have to be in a different environment, and then what our assumption is and what we think the move will actually accomplish. The longer somebody can age in their own home without having to move, their satisfaction, their well-being, and their perception of their quality of life is increased. And there's lots of other pluses, right? So even potentially the value of the home that they're in still is going to appreciate. Again, I'm not giving financial advice, and that's not a guarantee, but that's generally the way things work. So anyway, so if you're in the Twin Cities area, we're in Dakota County, we're in Burnsville, we'd love to engage with you and have a conversation, just help. We do no-cost care consultations to just meet with you and let you quiz us a bit and get to know who we are, but also help you somewhat practically to talk about these things and obviously set up the care if that's the need and a desire to be able to actually put care in place that really would elevate the quality of life for that person. So we'll have information in the description about how you can reach us. In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you in the comments about how we, maybe more content in terms of the videos that we do, or just in this, if you've got questions or if you have comments about how you've managed with helping your loved one age in place. We would love to hear from you. And there's so much wisdom in the cumulative knowledge. Every time I do presentations, I love the stories because the stories, they teach me. I learn a ton, and it's helpful, for people. That's why I think support groups are so productive and so helpful because it helps to know that my situation is not unique. I'm not the only one, but it also, the practical aspect of, I'm doing this and it's really helpful. Or we found a piece of tech that was really instrumental. Thank you for your attention and your time, and we will see you in the next video. Take care.